There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. They don't come with warnings. They don't arrive with dramatic music playing in the background or slow-motion cinematics to prepare you. They just happen, quietly, suddenly, in the middle of the most ordinary Tuesday afternoon you could ever imagine. And when they do, they change everything. This is one of those moments. And I need you to stay with me, because this story, it's going to reach somewhere deep inside your chest and press on something you forgot was there. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled, because stories like this one, they deserve to travel. They deserve to land in the hearts of people who need them most. And maybe today, that person is you. So let's begin. The city was doing what cities always do on a cold Wednesday afternoon in November. It was moving, rushing, buzzing with the kind of noise that makes you feel surrounded by a million people and completely alone at the same time. Glass towers caught the last pale light of the fading sun. Cabs honked. Suits hurried. Coffee cups were tossed into bins by people already thinking about the next thing on their list. Nobody slowed down. Nobody looked up. That's the thing about big cities. They train you to keep moving, to not notice, to mind your own business and get where you're going before someone else takes your spot. It's not cruel. It's survival. And most of the time, it works just fine. But not today. Today, something is going to happen inside a single elevator, a narrow rectangle of polished steel barely large enough to hold 7 people. That would stop time itself. That would make the city, just for a moment, hold its breath. The elevator was on the 42nd floor when it started filling up. One by one, people stepped in. A woman in a beige coat, scrolling through her emails without looking up. A young man in his 20s, earbuds in, head nodding slightly to music only he could hear. An older gentleman in a charcoal blazer, carrying a leather briefcase that had seen better decades. A couple standing close together, not speaking, the kind of silence that belongs only to people who have run out of things to pretend. And then him, James Calloway. He walked into the elevator the way he always walked into rooms, like he owned them, because in many cases, he actually did. At 51 years old, James Calloway was the CEO of Calloway Global Enterprises, a company that had its fingerprints on half the real estate, half the contracts, and a significant portion of the financial decisions made in this city over the last 2 decades. He was tall, silver-haired, always impeccably dressed. Today it was a deep navy suit with a fine chalk stripe, cufflinks that caught the light, shoes polished to a mirror finish. He stepped into the elevator, stood near the back, and pulled out his phone. He did not make eye contact with anyone. He never did. And then, just before the doors could close, one more person slipped in. He almost didn't make it. You could see him jogging the last few steps down the hallway, one hand holding the strap of a battered canvas work bag, the other clutching something small, something that seemed almost out of place in a building this grand. A lunchbox. A small, slightly dented metal lunchbox covered in cartoon stickers. A yellow duck. A rainbow. A hand-drawn heart that looked like it had been stuck on by a child who pressed too hard with their fingers. The man who carried it was 36 years old. His name was Ethan Cole. He wore faded dark jeans, steel-toed work boots that had logged thousands of miles across the floors of buildings just like this one, and a gray work jacket with the logo of a small maintenance company stitched over the left pocket in slightly unraveling thread. His hair was a little longer than he probably meant it to be, the kind of length that happens when you're too tired to think about haircuts. His face carried the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from one bad night of sleep. It comes from years of them. Ethan Cole had just finished a double shift. He had been in this building since 5:30 in the morning, working on the electrical systems in the basement and on several of the upper floors. It was the kind of work nobody thinks about until something stops working. Invisible labor, essential and unnoticed. He had crawled through access panels, replaced faulty wiring, documented everything meticulously, drunk 2 bad cups of vending machine coffee, and eaten a granola bar for lunch because there hadn't been time for anything else. Now it was nearly 7 in the evening, and he was going home. He stepped into the elevator, found a small space near the left wall, and held the lunchbox against his chest almost protectively The way you hold something precious without even realizing you're doing it. The doors slid shut with a quiet metallic click. For the first 30 seconds, nothing was unusual. The elevator hummed. Numbers climbed on the small screen above the doors. People looked at their phones, at their shoes, at the middle distance that elevator passengers always stare into, that particular nowhere that is neither here nor there. Ethan glanced down at the lunchbox. He smiled, just slightly, just for a second. It belonged to his daughter. Her name was Sophie. She was 7 years old, and she had the laugh of someone who had never once been told the world was a hard place. She had forgotten the lunchbox that morning, left it on the kitchen counter while she ran for the school bus, her backpack bouncing, her pigtails flying. Ethan had texted her teacher to let Sophie know not to worry, that Daddy had it, that he would bring it home. Inside the lunchbox were the crumbs of a peanut butter sandwich, an uneaten apple slice that had gone a little brown, and a folded piece of paper, a drawing Sophie had done before bed the night before and tucked in herself without telling him. He'd found it during his break. He'd unfolded it alone in a supply closet on the 38th floor. It showed two stick figures, one tall, one small, holding hands under a yellow sun. Beneath them, in the careful, oversized letters of a 7-year-old learning to write, were 4 words. Daddy is my hero. He had stood in that supply closet for a full minute, unable to move, pressing the drawing against his chest, his eyes stinging. Then he folded it carefully, placed it back inside the lunchbox, zipped it shut, and went back to work. Because that's what you do. That's what you always do when someone is counting on you. 3 years earlier, Ethan's wife, Clara, had been diagnosed with a sudden, aggressive illness. She was 33. She was healthy, funny, stubborn in the best way, and the kind of person who made every room feel warmer just by walking into it. The diagnosis came on a Friday. 18 months later, she was gone. Ethan had held Sophie in his arms the night Clara passed and told her that Mommy had gone somewhere beautiful, that she would always be watching. That love like Mommy's never really disappears. It just changes shape. He had said it with such steadiness that Sophie had believed him. He had cried alone in the bathroom after Sophie fell asleep, sitting on the cold tile floor, his back against the bathtub, making no sound because silence was the only thing he had left to give her. From that night forward, Ethan Cole had been both parents. He worked mornings. He worked nights. He took the jobs nobody else wanted, the early shifts, the double shifts, the emergency calls on Saturday mornings when a building system failed and someone needed to be there. He packed lunches. He read bedtime stories. He braided hair badly and apologized and watched YouTube tutorials to get better. He helped with homework at 10 o'clock at night when he could barely keep his eyes open. He never complained. Not once. Because every time he felt like he was sinking, he would look at Sophie, at her absolute, unwavering faith in him, and something in him would hold. The elevator was on the 28th floor when everything changed. 2 men. They had been standing near the control panel since the beginning, and in the way the threat sometimes hides in plain sight, no one had paid close attention to them. They were dressed ordinarily. Nothing alarming about their appearance. But the moment they began to move, the moment that shift happened in their posture, in the deliberate way they stepped forward, the entire elevator felt it. A cold current. Invisible but unmistakable. The woman in the beige coat looked up from her phone. The young man with the earbuds pulled one out. The older gentleman with the briefcase took a slow step backward without quite realizing he had done it. One of the men moved directly toward James Calloway. The other positioned himself near the elevator buttons, planting himself in front of the panel so that no one could reach it without going through him. And then the first man leaned close to Calloway, close enough that his words were low, private, meant only for him, though the silence in the elevator carried the weight of them to every single person present. James Calloway, the most powerful man in the room by every conventional measure, had gone pale. His phone was still in his hand, but he was no longer looking at it. He was looking at the man in front of him with the expression of someone who has just realized that none of the things they rely on, titles, money, lawyers, security teams, are here right now. That right now, in this small sealed space between floors 28 and 27, he is simply a man. And he is afraid. The air in the elevator changed completely. It became thick with the particular silence of people who desperately want to look away but cannot. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Except Ethan. He stood against the left wall, the lunchbox still pressed to his chest, and he watched. His heart was slamming. He could feel it in his throat, in his fingertips, in the space behind his eyes. Every instinct he had, the ones built from years of being careful, of being the one person his daughter could not afford to lose, was telling him to be still, to be small, to look at the floor. But he didn't look at the floor. He looked at the two men, then at Calloway, then at the other passengers, the woman who had pressed herself against the wall, the young man who looked like he might be sick, the older gentleman gripping his briefcase handle so hard his knuckles had whitened. And then something happened inside Ethan Cole that he couldn't fully explain later, even when he tried. He thought of Sophie. He thought of her drawing, of those 4 words written in crayon by a little girl who believed in him completely, without reservation, without condition. Daddy is my hero. He thought of her sitting at home right now, probably in her pajamas, probably watching cartoons with one eye on the door, waiting for the sound of his key in the lock. He thought of how she always ran to the door when she heard it, how she always crashed in him like a small, warm wave. He thought of her face, and he stepped forward. Oh, but what happened next? You're not ready for what happens next. Stay with me, because this story is just beginning, and I promise you, by the time we reach the end, something inside you is going to shift. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, please go back to part 1. For those of you who are still with me, thank you. Truly, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I want to know. I want to picture you in your car, in your kitchen, lying in bed with your earbuds in as I tell you the rest of this story. Because you deserve to hear it. Ethan stepped forward. Just one step. Not aggressive. Not dramatic. Not the kind of step that belongs in an action movie where someone rolls up their sleeves and squares their jaw. It was quieter than that. Softer. The kind of step a man takes when he's not entirely sure what he's doing, but something deeper than logic is pulling him forward anyway. The two men noticed immediately. The one standing at the control panel turned his head, eyes narrowing. The one closest to Calloway shifted his weight and looked at Ethan the way people look at an unexpected interruption. Irritated, dismissive, sizing him up in a single glance and deciding he was not a threat. A tired maintenance worker in a gray jacket. A man holding a child's lunchbox. Whatever they were expecting, a confrontation, an ultimatum, someone trying to play the hero, what they got was something else entirely. Ethan opened his mouth, and he said 6 words. 6. Simple. Words. I have a daughter waiting for me. The elevator went completely, utterly still. Not the tense stillness that had been building. Not the hell breath. Eyes down, please don't let anything happen stillness of the last 2 minutes. This was different. This was the stillness of something unexpected landing in the middle of a charged space and just sitting there. Impossible to ignore. Impossible to categorize. The man who had been looming over Calloway stopped. He stared at Ethan, and Ethan, steady, tired, a little pale, but absolutely calm, held up the lunchbox. Slowly, deliberately. The way you hold up something that matters. She forgot this morning, he said. His voice didn't waver. It didn't rise. It was the voice of a man who has spent 3 years learning how to be calm in every storm because someone small and precious needs him to be. She's 7. She made me a drawing last night and put it inside before she went to bed. I found it on my break. He paused. I promised her I'd be home tonight. Oh, there it was. Not power. Not bravery, not in the traditional sense, not a threat or a challenge or a demonstration of physical strength. Just a man, just a father, just the simplest, most human thing in the world. Love in its most undefended form, offered into a moment of danger like a candle carried into a storm. The woman in the beige coat pressed her hand to her mouth. The older gentleman with the briefcase looked down. The young man with the earbuds had long since taken them both out. He was watching Ethan with an expression that held no words. The man who had been blocking the elevator buttons shifted his weight. His eyes moved from Ethan to the lunchbox, to the cartoon stickers, the yellow duck, the handmade heart. Something crossed his face. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It wasn't a movie moment of sudden redemption with swelling music underneath it. It was subtler than that. A crack, just a hairline fracture in the hardness, the kind that happens when something you thought you had locked away gets touched without your permission. The other man, the one closest to Calloway, slowly unclenched his fist. Slowly. The kind of slowness that means a war is happening inside someone that you cannot see. Ethan didn't move, didn't press, didn't say another word. He just stood there, holding that lunchbox, looking at both men with an expression that held no contempt, no judgment, no fear. Just steadiness, just presence. And in the silence, something happened that nobody could fully explain afterward. The anger drained. Not all of it. Not permanently. Whatever history existed between these men and James Calloway, whatever wound, whatever grievance, whatever injustice real or imagined had brought them to this elevator on this afternoon, none of that disappeared. That was still there, underneath everything, complicated and unresolved. But the violence, the immediate, terrible momentum of it, stalled. Because Ethan hadn't appealed to their fear or their reason. He hadn't argued or negotiated or threatened. He had simply reminded them, reminded everyone in that elevator, that they were all, every single one of them, something more than this moment. That outside this sealed metal box, life was waiting. Real life. The kind with children and drawings and promises made over breakfast, and kept because you were someone's whole world. The elevator dinged. A soft, ordinary sound. Floor 25. The doors slid open, and the two men, without a word, without looking at anyone, stepped out, walked down the hallway, disappeared. The doors slid closed again. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. And then, all at once, the elevator exhaled. The woman in the beige coat made a sound, soft, shaky, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. The young man bent forward with his hands on his knees. The older gentleman set down his briefcase and pressed the back of his hand to his forehead. James Calloway stood motionless against the back wall. He was looking at Ethan. Ethan, who had already shifted the lunchbox back into the crook of his arm, who had already readjusted the strap of his worn canvas bag, who, if you didn't know what had just happened, looked like nothing more than a tired man at the end of a long day, ready to go home. Calloway opened his mouth. Nothing came out. What do you say to that? What words exist for what had just happened? Thank you seemed embarrassingly small. Are you okay? It felt absurd in reverse. He was the one who had just been standing in the shadow of something very dark, and this man, this quiet, ordinary, extraordinary man, had stepped into that shadow without armor, without strategy, armed with nothing but the truth of who he was. Calloway closed his mouth. He looked away. He looked at the floor, numbers climbing again. And for the first time in a very long time, James Calloway felt something he had almost forgotten the sensation of. Small, not humiliated, not diminished, but small in a way that reminds you that you are part of something much larger than yourself. Small in the way that is actually, underneath the discomfort of it, a gift. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened to the rush and noise of the building's ground floor. The marble atrium, the security desk, the revolving doors through which the city poured itself in and out all day long. People began to step out. Ethan moved toward the exit with the same quiet, unhurried pace he'd carried all day. He didn't look for acknowledgement. He didn't slow down to see if anyone would say something. He adjusted his bag strap, shifted the lunchbox, and walked toward the revolving doors. Behind him, Calloway watched. He watched this man in faded jeans and steel-toed boots disappear through the revolving door and into the cold November evening outside. He watched until the glass turned and Ethan Cole was gone, swallowed by the city that had no idea what had just happened. And Calloway stood in the lobby of the building that bore his name on a plaque above the entrance, surrounded by marble and security cameras and the hum of quiet, expensive machinery, and felt something crack open in his chest. Are you crying? Because I think I am. Hold on, we're not done yet. Not even close. Because this story has so much more left to give. And what comes next is the part that will make you believe, truly believe, that the world still has goodness woven through it. Stay with me for part 3. I need you to understand something before we go further. I need you to understand who Ethan Cole really was. Not as a character in a story, as a human being, as a father. Because what happens next, what Calloway does, what the world gives back to this man, it only means anything if you truly understand what Ethan had been carrying all this time. And I mean all of it. Drop a comment if you're still here. Tell me one word that describes how this story is making you feel. One word. I'll read every single one. Ethan's alarm went off at 4:45 every morning. Not 5, not 5:30, 4:45. He was always awake before it anyway, hovering in that thin space between sleep and waking that becomes permanent when you're a parent doing it alone. In those first few seconds, he always had the same half-second, the one that had never gone away in 3 years, where he would turn toward Clara's side of the bed before remembering. Then he would lie still for a moment. Then he would get up. He would shower quietly so as not to wake Sophie, who slept with her bedroom door open and one arm always hanging off the edge of the bed, like she was reaching for something even in sleep. He would make coffee, make her lunch, always a peanut butter sandwich because that was her favorite, always with a note, always something small and warm, a drawing he did himself of a sun or a dog or a smiley face because Clara had done that and he never wanted Sophie to stop finding notes in her lunchbox. Then he would bend over her, kiss her forehead, she always stirred but never fully woke, and leave for work in the dark. He did this 5, sometimes 6 days a week. On the 7th day, he was Sophie's dad. Fully, completely, totally. No phone, no work bag in the corner. Just the two of them. Board games and bad movies and cooking dinner together. Sophie standing on her stool at the counter with her little apron on, stirring things with great seriousness and announcing that she was a chef. Those Sundays were the reason he could do everything else. But the truth that Ethan never said out loud to anyone, was that he was running out of road. Not emotionally, not in terms of love for Sophie. That was bottomless and would never run out, not in 100 lifetimes. But practically, financially, physically, the double shifts were wearing him down in ways he could feel in his knees, in his lower back, in the way his hands sometimes shook slightly at the end of a long day. He was 36 years old, and some mornings his body argued with him like it was 60. And the money, it was never quite enough. Not really. Not with rent and Sophie's school supplies, and the medical bills still being paid off in small monthly installments from when Sophie had needed her tonsils out 2 winters ago. Not with the shoes she outgrew every 4 months. Not with the cost of the after-school program that kept her safe and cared for on the days he couldn't be there to pick her up. He had looked at the numbers enough times to know them by heart. He was 1 bad month away from not making it. 1 unexpected expense. 1 car repair. 1 week of missed work. He never let Sophie see any of this. She had the childhood he was determined to give her. She had birthday parties and Halloween costumes and a Christmas tree every December that they decorated together while singing along to songs on his phone. She had warmth and safety and the absolute certainty that her father was there and everything was okay. He protected that certainty with his whole life. But alone in the dark, he sometimes sat at the kitchen table after she was in bed, a cup of tea going cold in front of him, the bills spread out, a calculator on his phone, and the weight of it all pressed down on him like something physical. On those nights, he would take out Sophie's latest drawing. She drew him one every week. Always him, always with the sun overhead, always labeled in her careful letters, and hold it in his hands. And the weight would shift. Not disappear, just shift. Just enough. The evening of the elevator, he walked home. It was about 30 minutes on foot, but he liked it on nights when he wasn't too exhausted. Liked the way the city changed block by block as he got further from the glass towers and closer to the neighborhood where he and Sophie lived. The coffee shops gave way to bodegas. The marble lobbies gave way to brick stoops. The suits became jackets, and the jackets became the regular clothes of regular people going home to their regular lives. He bought a small bunch of flowers from a bucket outside a corner shop. $5, purple and yellow, the kind Sophie would immediately try to put in her hair. He let himself into the building, climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, and stood outside apartment 3C for a moment before he opened the door. He could hear the television inside. He could hear Sophie's voice. She was narrating something, the way she did when she was watching a show she'd seen before. saying the character's lines slightly ahead of them. He put his key in the lock. The door opened. "Daddy!" She came out of nowhere, a small, unstoppable force in dinosaur pajamas, crashing into his legs, wrapping her arms around his knees, nearly knocking him backward. The lunchbox swung. The flowers almost went flying. He laughed, the kind of laugh that is also just slightly a sob. He crouched down and gathered her up, lunchbox and flowers and all, and she wrapped herself around him and pressed her face in his neck. And he just held her. Just held her in the hallway outside their apartment on the third floor of a building that was nothing like the glass tower he'd spent his day in, and he thought, This is why. That night, after dinner, after the flowers were in a glass on the table and Sophie had indeed put one in her hair, after the dishes were done and the homework was finished and the bath was run and the pajamas were on. After all of it, they sat together on the couch, Sophie tucked under his arm, and he read her 3 chapters of her favorite book. She fell asleep against his shoulder before the 3rd chapter ended. He sat there for a long time without moving, just breathing, just being there, just being her dad. He didn't tell anyone about what had happened in the elevator. Not his coworker, who texted to ask how the shift had gone. Not his mother, who called on Sundays. Not the neighbor down the hall, who sometimes watched Sophie in emergencies. It didn't feel like his story to tell. It had happened. It was real. And then it was over, and he had gone home, and Sophie had been her dinosaur pajamas. And that was the whole point, wasn't it? That was always the whole point. He had no idea that across the city, in the penthouse apartment of a building that overlooked the river, a man in a navy suit with a chalk stripe was sitting in a very large, very quiet room, unable to sleep, thinking about 6 words. Thinking about a lunchbox. Thinking about a daughter waiting for her father to come home. I need a moment. And I think you might too. Because what's coming in part 4, what James Calloway does next, it's going to reach into your chest and hold something there. Don't go anywhere. James Calloway did not sleep that night. He lay in his $1,200 sheets in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling that was lit faintly by the city outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, and he turned it over and over and over. 6 words. I have a daughter waiting for me. He had spent 30 years building, acquiring, negotiating. He had sat across tables from some of the most powerful people in the world and not blinked. He had made decisions that moved money and people and entire neighborhoods. He had, by every external measure, won. And tonight, a tired man in a gray work jacket, holding a child's lunchbox, not even 37 years old, running on bad coffee and 3 hours of sleep and pure love, had walked into the worst moment of Calloway's recent life and diffused it with the simplest, most human thing imaginable. He hadn't been trying to be brave. That was the part Calloway couldn't shake. He hadn't been performing courage. He hadn't been calculating an outcome. He had simply said the truest thing about himself and offered it into the darkness without knowing what it would do. Calloway got out of bed at 2 in the morning and sat at his desk. He had his assistant pull the building records first thing in the morning, maintenance logs, contract workers on site that day, the afternoon shift on the electrical team. He was careful about how he asked for it, because he didn't want this to feel like surveillance. He didn't want to intrude on this man's life. He just needed to know who he was. The name came back within the hour. Ethan Cole, maintenance technician, contract worker through a mid-sized service company. I am 36 years old, single parent, on site since 5:30 that morning, logged out at 7:12 p.m. Calloway sat with that information for a long time. Then he started asking questions, not through his lawyers, not through his HR department, quietly, carefully, through people he trusted to be discreet. He wanted to understand who this man was, not to expose him, not to turn his act of quiet courage into a PR moment, but because something in Calloway had woken up, something that had been asleep for a very long time, and it was asking him to pay attention. What he found out made him set down his coffee and sit very still. He learned about Clara. He learned about the diagnosis, the 18 months, the way Ethan had kept working through all of it to keep them afloat, while also being at her side whenever he possibly could. He learned about the funeral, small, quiet, in a church 3 miles from the apartment, and how Ethan had held Sophie's hand the entire time and hadn't cried until he was alone. He learned about the double shifts, the bills, the after-school program, The Tuesday nights when Ethan worked until 10 p.m. and his neighbor, Mrs. Okafor from 3D, a 70-year-old woman with a bad hip and a generous soul, stayed with Sophie and let her watch cooking shows until he got home. He learned about the Sunday mornings, the board games, the cooking together, the way Sophie had apparently announced to her teacher last month that her father was the best chef in the world because he let her stir. And then he learned the number, the actual monthly number, what Ethan brought in, what went out, what was left. Calloway had made that number in the time it took to read the report. And he sat with that, with the obscenity and the injustice and the pure, aching wrongness of it. That a man of this quality, this decency, this strength, this love, was one bad month from the edge. While Calloway sat in a penthouse and stared at a ceiling that cost more than Ethan earned in a year, he picked up a pen. He set it down. He picked it up again. It took him 3 attempts to write the letter. The first draft was too formal, full of corporate language, structured like a business communication, cold in the way that powerful people's gratitude sometimes is because they've forgotten how to speak without intermediaries. He threw it away. The second draft was too effusive, falling over itself, almost desperate, the kind of writing that happens when you're trying to compensate for guilt and the compensation shows. He threw that away too. The third draft was just honest. It said, "I was in that elevator. I know what you did, and I know you didn't do it for any reward. I know you probably went home and didn't tell anyone. That's exactly who you are. And I would like, if you'll allow me, to say thank you in a way that is equal to what you gave." He wrote about what he'd learned, not intrusively, just enough to show that he had looked, that he had paid attention, that he was not treating this like a transaction. He wrote about Clara in a way that he hoped was careful and respectful. He wrote about Sophie, about the lunchbox, about the way Ethan had held it up, about how that small action had cracked something open in him that he was grateful for. And then he wrote the offer. The offer was this. Calloway Global had a division, a fairly new one, and genuinely important, that oversaw safety operations across a portfolio of commercial buildings in the city. It required someone with real technical knowledge, with hands-on understanding of how these buildings actually worked from the inside out, from the electrical systems to the ventilation to the emergency protocols. It required someone to be calm under pressure. The salary was more than triple what Ethan was currently making. The hours were stable, 8 to 4, Monday through Friday, with flexibility for family needs built into the contract explicitly. There was a benefits package, full health coverage, dental, a pension, paid leave, real paid leave, not the theoretical kind that people with 2 jobs can never actually use. And there was one more thing. Calloway had added it at the last minute. Not sure if it was too much, not sure if it would feel like charity, but unable not to include it. A scholarship fund, established in Clara Cole's name, would cover Sophie's education through university, fully, entirely, regardless of what she chose to study or where she chose to go. He sealed the letter. He had it delivered by hand to the maintenance company's office, marked for Ethan's attention, with a note on the outside that said simply, "Please give this to him privately. It's personal." Ethan received it on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the elevator. He was called into the site manager's office, a small room smelling of coffee and old carpet that he'd been in maybe 4 times in 3 years. His first thought, walking in, was that something had gone wrong. A complaint, a mistake in the wiring documentation. Something. The site manager handed him the envelope with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read, a mix of surprise and something warmer. "It came through for you personally," the manager said. "No idea what it is." Ethan took it. He stood in the hallway outside the office and opened it. He read it once. He had to sit down. There was a bench near the vending machines, old, slightly uncomfortable, and he sat on it and read the letter again. His hands were not quite steady. The paper made a faint sound, the way paper does when the hands holding it aren't fully still. By the third read, his vision had gone blurry. He pressed the letter against his chest, the same way he had pressed Sophie's drawing. And he sat there for a while, in the hallway by the vending machines, not caring if anyone walked by and saw. He thought of Clara. He thought of what she would say. He could hear her, almost, that particular voice she had when something moved her, slightly exasperated by her own emotion, saying, "Oh, honestly," through a wet laugh. He thought of Sophie, of her scholarship, her future, the thing he lay awake fearing most, that he might not be able to give her what she deserved. Suddenly, impossibly provided for. Not by charity, not by pity, by a man who had been paying attention. He folded the letter carefully, put it in his jacket pocket, against his heart, and he went back to work. Because that's what you do. Tell me in the comments. And if you've dealt with something similar, share your story. You're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. This is part 4, and I know what you're thinking, but what happened next? Did he take the job? Oh, he did. But the story of what happened after, what changed and what didn't, and what surprised even Ethan himself about the whole thing. That's for part 5. And part 5 is where this story goes somewhere you're absolutely not expecting. He called the number on a Sunday. He had waited the full weekend. Not out of hesitation. Not really. He knew what his answer was. He had heard it in the hallway by the vending machines, with the letter pressed against his chest. He had known it when he read it to himself again that night after Sophie was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the bills pushed to one side. He waited until the weekend because he wanted to do it right. He wanted to think it through fully, calmly, without the overwhelm of the first read. And he wanted to make sure that what he was saying yes to was something he could stand behind completely. He could. He called on a Sunday morning while Sophie was watching cartoons in the living room, her cereal half-eaten on the coffee table, her hair still messy from sleep. A woman answered, calm, professional, clearly expecting the call. Mr. Cole, thank you for calling. Mr. Calloway would like to speak with you directly, if that's all right. There was a brief pause. Then Ethan, not Mr. Cole, not sir, just his name, said simply, in the voice of a man who had been sitting at his desk on a Sunday morning waiting for this call. Mr. Calloway, Ethan said. James, the other man said. Please. They spoke for 40 minutes. Not about the offer. They covered that in the first 10. The rest was something else. It was two men from very different worlds talking about life. About what you realize when you almost lose something. About what it costs to be the kind of person you want to be. About daughters. It turned out that James Calloway had a daughter too. He and his daughter had not spoken in 4 years. There had been a disagreement, the kind that starts as one thing and becomes another, that hardens over time into something neither party knows how to cross anymore. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone in years. Hadn't quite admitted, even to himself, how much it weighed on him. But he mentioned it to Ethan, on the phone, on a Sunday morning, for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Ethan listened. He didn't offer advice, didn't tell Calloway what to do. Just listen in the way that people who have known real grief listen, fully, without rushing toward resolution. When Calloway finished, there was a pause. And then Ethan said, call her. Whatever happened, call her. Life is really, really short. James Calloway called his daughter that afternoon. Her name was Rachel. She answered on the 4th ring, and when she heard his voice, there was a long silence. The kind of silence that holds 4 years of distance in it. The kind that could go either way. He didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't have a prepared speech. He just said, I've been thinking about you. I miss you. I'm sorry. She didn't respond immediately. And then she said, okay, Dad. 2 words. That was all. But in them, the whole thing, the whole 4 years shifted. They talked for an hour. They made plans to have dinner. That Friday, James Calloway sat across a restaurant table from his 30-year-old daughter for the first time in 4 years and, according to the staff who saw them, barely touched their food because they were too busy talking. Ethan started the new position on the first Monday of the following month. He drove to work for the first time in years. There was a parking spot for him, a real parking spot with his name on it, which Sophie thought was the most impressive thing she had ever seen in her life when he showed her on the weekend. You have a sign? She said, pointing at the small placard. With your name on it? With my name on it, he confirmed. She considered this with great seriousness. I'm going to get a sign, she decided. He laughed so hard he had to lean against the car. The work itself suited him in ways he hadn't anticipated. His years on the floor, in the access panels and the stairwells and the electrical rooms of a dozen buildings, had given him a kind of knowledge that no office job could replicate. He knew how things actually worked. He knew where the systems were most likely to fail and why, and what needed to happen before failure rather than after. His team, a small group of technicians and safety coordinators, took to him quickly because he was one of them, because he didn't manage from a distance, because he rolled up his sleeves and came down to the floor and looked at the actual thing and asked real questions. Calloway checked in occasionally, not hovering, just present. The way a person is present when they have decided to pay attention to something they value. At their second meeting, 3 months into the role, he told Ethan that the safety incident report rate across the buildings in the portfolio had dropped significantly since Ethan had taken over. Not because of any single dramatic change, but because of dozens of small ones, small preventative measures, small adjustments, small moments of someone paying attention before things went wrong. Ethan nodded. "Small things matter," he said simply. Calloway looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said, "they do. But the thing that changed most, the thing that Ethan felt most in the marrow of his bones, was the evenings. He was home by 4:30 most days. 4:30. He was there when Sophie got off the school bus. He was there to hear about her day while it was still fresh, still warm, still full of all the tiny important things that had happened. Who was funny, what they'd learned in science, the drama of the cafeteria seating chart. He was there to make dinner, not to heat something up in exhausted silence, but to actually cook, to let Sophie stand on her stool and stir and announce her opinions on seasoning with the authority of someone who had been cooking for decades. He was there for bath time and pajama time and bedtime stories. He was there, actually there, not present in the hollowed-out way of a man running on empty, showing up because he had to, but genuinely, fully, warmly there, with energy left, with laughter still in him, with the capacity to be what she needed him to be, not just in duty but in joy. He hadn't realized how much he had been missing this. He hadn't let himself realize it, because you can't miss what you can't afford to give. But now he could afford it, and it was everything. One evening, about 4 months into the new job, he was sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. Sophie was drawing. She was always drawing, working on something with her tongue between her teeth in concentration. Ethan had a cup of tea. The apartment was warm. It was raining outside, soft against the window. He was looking at nothing in particular when Sophie suddenly pushed a piece of paper across the table toward him. He looked down. It was a drawing. 2 figures, tall and small, holding hands. A sun overhead. And underneath, in letters slightly more confident than the last time she had written it, "Daddy is still my hero." Still, that one word. He put the drawing down. He covered his face with both hands. He sat there for a long moment, his shoulders shaking slightly. Sophie watched him with large, serious eyes. Then she got up from her chair, walked around the table, and climbed into his lap. She put both small arms around his neck and pressed her face against his cheek. "It's okay, Daddy," she said softly. "Sometimes heroes cry too." He told me later that was the moment he understood something he'd been trying to figure out for 3 years. The whole time he had been protecting Sophie from the weight of his grief, from the fear and the exhaustion and the strain. The whole time he had been performing steadiness for her benefit. She had known. Children always know. Not the details, not the numbers, but the weight. They feel it, the way they feel warmth or cold or love. She had known, and she had loved him anyway. She had loved him not despite his humanness, but through it. And in loving him that way, in climbing into his lap and telling him it was okay, heroes cry too, she had given him something he had not known he needed. Permission. Permission to be human in front of her. Permission to let her see that strength and grief and love and exhaustion can all exist in the same person at the same time. That being someone's hero doesn't mean being untouchable. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let the people who love you love you. The lunchbox still sat on the kitchen counter. He had never replaced it, even though it was dented and 2 of the stickers were peeling at the edges. Sophie had declared her favorite because it was famous. It went to work with Daddy. She would tell people importantly, though she didn't know the full story yet. He would tell her someday, when she was older, when she could hold the whole of it. He would sit her down and tell her about a November afternoon in an elevator In a moment when her small lunchbox with the yellow duck and the handmade heart had traveled into the scariest space her father had ever been in and traveled back out again. When he would tell her that he had held it up in a room full of fear and it had meant something, that the thought of her, the simple, absolute truth of her, had been the bravest thing he possessed. He would tell her that sometimes you don't know how strong you are until something requires you to be. And she would listen, wide-eyed, her chin in her hands, the way she listened to all the best stories. And she would say, "I knew it." Somewhere across the city, on a Friday evening, James Calloway was having dinner with his daughter Rachel for the third time in as many months. He was laughing at something she said, really laughing, the way he hadn't laughed in years. And somewhere on the 25th floor of a building downtown, two men were dealing with whatever they had been dealing with before the elevator, working through it, whatever working through it looked like for them, in ways that had nothing to do with this story. Because lives don't resolve cleanly. They continue. They're complicated and ongoing and full of things still to be figured out. But in one apartment on the third floor of a building 3 miles from the glass towers, on a rainy Tuesday evening, a father and a daughter sat at a kitchen table in the warmth, and the rain fell soft against the window, and the lunchbox sat on the counter, and the drawing was on the fridge held up by a magnet shaped like a sun. And everything, for this moment, in this place, was okay. More than okay. Tell me in the comments, what did this story make you feel? Which part stayed with you the longest? Was it the elevator? The letter? Sophie climbing into his lap? Tell me in the comments. And if you've dealt with something similar, if you've been the person holding the weight in silence, if you've been the person who stepped forward when everything in you said stay back, if you've been the child watching a parent be human and loving them more for it, share your story. You're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. Because stories are how we find each other. And if this one found you today, if it pressed on something in your chest that needed pressing on, if it made you think of someone you love or someone you haven't called in too long or something you've been carrying without telling anyone, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. It traveled all the way from a keyboard to wherever you are right now, in your car, your kitchen, your bed, your whatever. It found you. And I am so glad it did. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying until the end. Now, go call someone you love. Go home. Your people are waiting.